Hey everybody, this is the introduction and stuff to the for Louis Althusser's For Marx, translated by Brewster. Starts with a dedication. These pages are dedicated to Jacques Martin, the friend who, in the most terrible ordeal alone, discovered the road to Marx's philosophy and guided me on to it. Louis Althusser. It starts with a section titled "My English to my English readers." I should like briefly to present this translation of For Marx to an English audience, and on the same occasion to make use of the time that has elapsed since it was written to take some, quote, bearings, end quote, on the philosophical content and the ideological significance of this small book. For Marx appeared in France in 1965, but only its introduction today dates from that year. All the other chapters were published earlier, between 1960 and 1964, in the form of articles in the French Communist Party journals. Footnote: with the exception of the article on Bertolazzi and Brecht, which was published in the Catholic Review Esprit. End footnote. They were collected together exactly as originally written, without any corrections or alterations. To understand these essays and to pass judgment on them, it is essential to realize that they were conceived, written, and published by a communist philosopher in a particular ideological and theoretical conjuncture. So these texts must be taken for what they are. They are philosophical essays, the first stages of a long-term investigation, preliminary results which obviously demand correction. This investigation concerns the specific nature of the principles of the science and philosophy founded by Marx. However, these philosophical essays do not derive from a merely erudite or speculative investigation. These philosophical essays are simultaneously interventions into a definite conjuncture. Section 1. As the introduction shows, this conjuncture is, first, the theoretical and ideological conjuncture in France, more particularly the present conjuncture in the French Communist Party and in French philosophy. But as well as this peculiarly French conjuncture, it is also the present ideological and theoretical conjuncture in the international, capital C, communist movement. Of course, the essays you are about to read do not bear on the political elements of this conjuncture. The policies of the capital C communist parties, the capital C part is me saying it. The policies of the capital C communist parties, the split in the international capital C communist movement. The essays deal with the ideological and theoretical problems present in the conjuncture and produced by the conjuncture. In certain respects, these problems are new problems. In others, they refer us back to debates which have long characterized the history of the workers' movement. A consideration of the recent elements of this conjuncture reveals that, since Stalin's death, the international, capital C, communist movement has lived in a conjuncture dominated by two great events: the critique of the, quote, cult of personality, end quote, by the 20th Congress, and the rupture that has occurred between the Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Communist Party. The denunciation of the, quote, cult of personality, end quote, and the abrupt conditions and the forms in which it took place have had profound repercussions, not only in the political domain, but in the ideological domain as well. In what follows, I shall deal only with the ideological reactions of capital C communist intellectuals. The critique of Stalinist, quote, dogmatism, end quote, was generally, quote, lived, end quote, by capital C communist intellectuals as a, quote, liberation. This, quote, liberation gave birth to a profound ideological reaction, quote, liberal and, quote, ethical in tendency, which spontaneously rediscovered the old philosophical themes of, quote, freedom, quote, man, the, quote, human person, and, quote, alienation. This ideological tendency looked for theoretical justification to Marx's early works, which do indeed contain all the arguments of a philosophy of man, man's alienation and liberation. These conditions have paradoxically turned the tables in Marxist philosophy. Since the 1930s, Marx's early works have been a warhorse for petty bourgeois intellectuals in their struggle against Marxism. I was reading, this is, and when people talk about, right here, when people talk about E.P. Thompson and other people talk about like Althusser's like refurbished Stalinism. This is on the theoretical terrain. This is kind of like precisely what they're talking about here, because this is like not just something. This is not like this this kind of critique of people that draw on the early Marx. And for grasping concepts such as like alienation, was something that was like as a, from what I've seen, especially if you look at the work of Irving Fetcher, this was straight up like the ideological line of the communist bloc. The distinction between Marx's like pre-Marxist writings, so-called, and his mature science. So this is Althusser is not saying something terribly original here. This is a matter of course in Soviet discourse on Marx. Since the 1930s, Marx's early works have been a warhorse for petty bourgeois intellectuals in their struggle against Marxism, but little by little and then massively, they have been set to work in the interest of a new, quote, interpretation, end quote, of Marxism, which is today being openly developed by many capital C communist intellectuals, quote, liberated from Stalinist dogmatism by the 20th Congress. And I'm not sure who's being properly referred to here within the capital C communist movement, but to my understanding, within the capital C Communist Party of France, there was like a humanist strain, and I think it was kind of dominant, even though historically it's probably looked at differently, but I think it's around like Lucien Sèvres and in a different sense Roger Garaudy, who went on to become a Holocaust denier. That doesn't, not that it says anything about his work at any particular time prior to that, just as a interesting, horrifying side note. But I think there was like a humanist strain within like the ideological field of the French Communist Party around Lucien Sèvres and Roger Garaudy. Maybe I'm overestimating Garaudy. Maybe I'm not as confident as about Garaudy, but I know that's the case with Lucien Sèvres. The themes of, quote, Marxist humanism, end quote, and the, quote, humanist interpretations of Marx's work have progressively and irresistibly imposed themselves on recent Marxist philosophy, even inside Soviet and Western communist parties. If this ideological reaction, characteristic above all of communist intellectuals, has despite some resistance been capable of such a development, is because it has benefited from the direct or indirect support of certain political slogans laid down by the communist parties of the USSR and the West. On the one side, for example, the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union declared that with the disappearance of the class struggle, the dictatorship of the proletariat had been, quote, superseded, end quote, in the USSR, that the Soviet state is no longer a class state, but the, quote, state of the whole people, end quote, and that the USSR is embarked on the, quote, construction of communism, end quote, guided by the, quote, humanist slogan, end quote, everything for man, end quote. On the other, for example, Western communist parties have pursued policies of unity with socialists, Democrats, and Catholics guided by certain slogans of related resonance, in which the accent is put on the, quote, peaceful transition to socialism, and, quote, on, quote, Marxist or, quote, socialist humanism, and, quote, on, quote, dialogue, and, quote, etc. Another person that I can think of within the mainstream, more in the mainstream communist movement, that would have been important of like this humanist strand would have been Adam Schaff in Poland. The, quote, humanist interpretations of Marxist theory which have developed under these definite circumstances represent a new phenomenon as compared with the period just past, the period between 1930 and 1956. However, they have many historical precedents in the history of the workers' movement. Marx, Engels, and Lenin, to refer only to them, ceaselessly struggled against ideological interpretations of an idealist humanist type that threatened Marxist theory. Here it will suffice to recall Marx's rupture with Feuerbach's humanism, Engels' struggle against Dühring, Lenin's long battle with the Russian populists, and so on. This whole past, this whole heritage is obviously part of the present theoretical and ideological conjuncture of the international capital C communist movement. As a side note, I think one of some of the humanistic interpretations is that I think that and I'm not sure about the whole intellectual history of it, but Gramsci's work being like an important I think is an important resource for like people coming within the mainstream communist movement having like a humanist interpretation of Marx, or quote humanist, I guess I should say. To return to the recent aspects of this conjuncture, I shall add the following remark. In the text entitled Marxism and Humanism, dating from 1963, I have already interpreted the present inflation of the themes of Marxist or socialist, quote, humanism as an ideological phenomenon. In no sense was I condemning ideologies as social reality. As Marx says, it is in ideology that men quote, become conscious, end quote, of their class conflict and, quote, fight it out, end quote, in its religious, ethical, legal, and political forms, etc. Ideology is an objective social reality. The ideological struggle is an organic part of the class struggle. On the other hand, I criticize the theoretical effects of ideology, which are always a threat or a hindrance to scientific knowledge, and I pointed out that the inflation of the themes of, quote, Marxist humanism and their encroachment on Marxist theory should be interpreted as a possible historical symptom of a double inability and a double danger, an inability to think the specificity of Marxist theory, and correlatively, a revisionist danger of confusing it with pre-Marxist ideological interpretations, and an inability to resolve the real, basically political and economic problems posed by the conjuncture since the 20th Congress, and a danger of masking these problems with the false, quote, solution, end quote, of some merely ideological formulae. Section 2. It was in this conjuncture that the texts you are about to read were conceived and published. They must be related to this conjuncture to appreciate fully their nature and function. They are philosophical essays, with theoretical investigations as their objects and as their aim, and an intervention in the present theoretico-ideological conjuncture in reaction to its dangerous tendencies. Very schematically, I should say that these theoretical texts contain a double, quote, intervention, or if you prefer, they, quote, intervene on two fronts to trace, in Lenin's excellent expression, a, quote, line of demarcation, end quote, between Marxist theory on the one hand and ideological tendencies foreign to Marxism on the other. The object of the first intervention is to, quote, draw a line of demarcation, end quote, between Marxist theory and the forms of philosophical and political subjectivism which have compromised it or threaten it. Above all, empiricism and its variants, classical and modern, pragmatism, voluntarism, historicism, etc. The essential moments of this intervention are a recognition of the importance of Marxist theory in the revolutionary class struggle, a distinction of the different practices, a demonstration of the specificity of, quote, theoretical practice, end quote, a first investigation into the revolutionary specificity of Marxist theory, a total distinction between the idealist dialectic and the materialist dialectic, etc. The first intervention is situated essentially in the terrain of the confrontation between Marx and Hegel. The object of the second intervention is to, quote, draw a line of demarcation, and quote, between the true theoretical bases of the Marxist science of history and Marxist philosophy on the one hand, and on the other, the pre-Marxist idealist notions on which depend contemporary interpretations of Marxism as a, quote, philosophy of man, end quote, or a, quote, humanism, end quote. The essential components of this second intervention are the demonstration of a, quote, epistemological break, end quote, in the history of Marxist thought, a basic difference between the ideological, quote, problematic, end quote, of the early works and the scientific, quote, problematic of Capital, first investigations into the specificity of Marxist theoretical discovery, etc. The second intervention is situated essentially in the terrain of the confrontation between Marx's early works and Capital. Behind the detail of the arguments, textual analyses, and theoretical discussions, these two interventions reveal a major opposition. The opposition that separates science from ideology, or more precisely, that separates a new science in process of self-constitution from the pre-scientific theoretical ideologies that occupy the, quote, terrain in which it is establishing itself. This is an important point. What we are dealing with in the opposition, science/ideologies, concerns the, quote, break relationship between a science and the theoretical ideology in which the object it gave the knowledge of was, quote, thought before the foundation of the science. This, quote, break leaves intact the objective social domain occupied by ideologies, religion, ethics, legal and political ideologies, etc. In this domain of non-theoretical ideologies, too, there are, quote, ruptures and, quote, breaks, but they are political effects of political practice of great revolutionary events, and not, quote, epistemological, end quote. This opposition between science and ideology, and the notion of a, quote, epistemological break, end quote, that helps us to think its historical character, refer to a thesis that, although always present in the background of these analyses, is never explicitly developed. The thesis that Marx's discovery is a scientific discovery without historical precedent in its nature and effects. Indeed, in conformity with the tradition constantly reiterated by the classics of Marxism, we may claim that Marx established a new science, the science of the history of, quote, social formations, end quote. To be more precise, I should say that Marx, quote, opened up, end quote, for scientific knowledge a, quote, new continent, end quote, that of history, just as Thales, I think, opened up the, quote, continent, end quote, of mathematics for scientific knowledge, and Galileo opened up the, quote, continent of physical nature for scientific knowledge. I should add that, just as the foundation of mathematics by Thales, I don't know if I'm saying that right, quote, induced the birth of the Platonic philosophy, just as the foundation of physics by Galileo, quote, induced the birth of Cartesian philosophy, etc., so the foundation of the science of history by Marx has, quote, induced the birth of a new theoretically and practically revolutionary philosophy, Marxist philosophy, or dialectical materialism. I believe the term dialectical materialism was not coined by Marx or Engels, but by Plekhanov. I'm pretty sure. The fact that from the standpoint of its theoretical elaboration, this unprecedented philosophy still lags behind the Marxist science of history, historical materialism, is explained by historico-political reasons and also simultaneously by theoretical reasons. Great philosophical revolutions are always preceded and, quote, borne along, end quote, by the great scientific revolutions, quote, active, end quote, in them. But long theoretical labor and long historical maturing are required before they can acquire an explicit and adequate form. If the accent is laid on Marxist philosophy in the text you are about to read, it is to assess both its reality and its right to existence, but also its lateness, and to begin to provide it with a theoretical form of existence a little more adequate to its nature. Section 3. Naturally, these texts are marked, and sometimes sensibly so, not only by errors and inaccuracies, but also by silences or half-silences. Neither the impossibility of saying everything at once nor the urgency of the conjuncture completely explain all these silences and their effects. In fact, I was not equipped for an adequate treatment of certain questions. Some difficult points were obscure to me. As a result, in my text, I did not take into account certain important problems and realities, as I should have. As a, quote, self-criticism, unquote, I should like to signal two particularly important points. If I did lay stress on the vital necessity of theory for revolutionary practice, and therefore denounced all forms of empiricism, I did not discuss the problem of the, quote, union of theory and practice, unquote, which has played such a major role in the Marxist-Leninist tradition. No doubt I did speak of the union of theory and practice within, quote, theoretical practice, unquote, but I did not enter into the question of the union of theory and practice within political practice. Let us be precise. I did not examine the general form of historical existence of this union, the, quote, fusion of Marxist theory and the workers' movement. The, quote, fusion of Marxist theory and the workers' movement. I did not examine the concrete forms of existence, of this, quote, fusion. Organization of the class struggle, trade unions, parties, the means and methods of direction of the class struggle by these organizations, etc. I did not give precise indication as to the function, place, and role of Marxist theory in these concrete forms of existence, where and how Marxist theory intervenes in the development of political practice, where and how political practice intervenes in the development of Marxist theory. I have learnt from experience that my silence on these questions has not been without its consequences for certain, quote, theorists, quote, theoreticist, and quote, readings, and quote, of my essays. Similarly, if I did insist on the theoretically revolutionary character of Marx's discovery and pointed out that Marx had founded a new science and a new philosophy, I left vague the difference distinguishing philosophy from science, a difference which is, however, of great importance. I did not show what it is, as distinct from science, that constitutes philosophy proper. The organic relation between every philosophy is a theoretical discipline, and even within its theoretical forms of existence and exigencies and politics. I did not point out the nature of this relation, which in Marxist philosophy has nothing to do with a pragmatic relation. So I did not show clearly enough what in this respect distinguishes Marxist philosophy from earlier philosophies. I have learnt from experience that my half-silence on these questions has not been without its consequences for certain, quote, positivist, end quote, readings, end quote, of my essays. I intend to return to these two important questions, which are intimately connected from a theoretical and practical point of view in later studies. Althusser, October 1967. Introduction. Today. Section 1. I ventured to publish together these jottings, which have appeared in various magazines during the last 4 years. Some of them are now obtainable. This is my first purely practical excuse. If, hesitant and incomplete as they are, they nevertheless make some sense, this should be brought out by grouping them together. This is my second excuse. Ultimately, I must present them for what they are, the documentation of a particular history. the documentation of a particular history. Nearly all these pieces were born of some conjuncture, a comment on a book, an answer to criticism or objections, an analysis of a theoretical production, etc. They are marked by their date of birth, even in their inconsistencies, which I have decided not to correct. I have struck out a few passages of unduly personal polemic. I have inserted a small number of words, notes, or pages that had then to be cut, either to spare the feelings of those with certain prejudices or to reduce my exposition to a suitable length. I have also corrected a few references. Each the result of a special occasion, these pieces are nonetheless products of the same epoch and same history. In our own way, they are witnesses to the unique experience which all the philosophers of my generation who tried to think with Marx had to live. The investigation of Marx's philosophical thought, indispensable if we are to escape from the theoretical impasse in which history had put us. History, it had stolen our youth with the Popular Front in the Spanish Civil War, and in the war, World War II, as such it had imprinted in us the terrible education of deeds. It surprised us just as we entered the world, and turned us students of bourgeois or petty bourgeois origin into men advised of the existence of classes, of their struggles and aims. From the evidence it forced on us, we drew the only possible conclusion, and rallied to the political organization of the working class, the capital C Communist Party. The war was just over. We were brutally cast in the party's great political and ideological battles. We had to measure up to our choice and take the consequences. In our political memory, this period remains the time of huge strikes and demonstrations, of the Stockholm Appeal and of the peace movement, the time when the great hopes aroused by the resistance faltered, and the long and bitter struggle began in which innumerable human hands would push back the shadow of catastrophe into the Cold War horizon. In our philosophical memory, it remains the period of intellectuals in arms, hunting out error from all its hiding places, of the philosophers we were, without writings of our own, but making politics out of all writing, and slicing up the world with a single blade, arts, literatures, philosophy, sciences, with the pitiless demarcation of class, the period summed up in caricature by a single phrase, a banner flapping in the void, quote, bourgeois science, proletarian science, end quote. To defend Marxism, imperiled as Marxism was by Lysenko's, quote, biology, end quote, and the fury of bourgeois spite, some leaders had relaunched this old, quote, left wing, end quote, formula, once the slogan of Bogdanov and the prolet cult. Once it proclaimed it dominated everything. Under its imperative line, what then counted as philosophy could only choose between commentary and silence, between conviction, whether inspired or forced, and dumb embarrassment. Paradoxically, it was none other than Stalin, whose contagious and implacable system of government and thought had induced this delirium, who reduced the madness to a little more reason, reading between the lines of the few simple pages in which he reproached the zeal of those who are making strenuous efforts to prove language a superstructure. We could see that there were limits to the use of the class criterion, and that we had been made to treat silence, a status claimed by every page of Marx, as merely the first comer among ideologies. We had to retreat, and in semi-disarray, return to first principles. I write these lines for my own part, and as a capital C communist, inquiring into our past solely for some light on our present, which will then illuminate our future. Neither bitterness nor nostalgia makes me recall this episode, but the wish to sanction it by a comment that will supersede it. We were at the age of enthusiasm and trust. We lived at a time when the enemy gave no quarter, the language of slander sustaining his aggression. But this did not save us from remaining long confused by this detour into which certain of our leaders, far from holding us back from the slope of theoretical, quote, leftism, had actively led us without the others showing any sign of restraining them or giving us any warning or advice. So we spent the best part of our time in agitation when we would have been better employed in the defense of our right and duty to know, and in study for production as such. For we did not even take this time. We knew nothing of Bogdanov and the Proletkult, or of Lenin's historic struggle against political and theoretical leftism, capital L leftism. We were not even intimately familiar with Marx's mature works, as we were only too eager and happy to rediscover our own burning passions in the ideological flame of Marx's early works. But what of our elders, those whose responsibility it was to show us the way? How was it that they too were living in the same ignorance? This long theoretical tradition, worked out in so many trials and struggles, blazoned by the testimony of so many great texts, how could it have become a dead letter for them? In this way we came to realize that under the protection of the reigning dogmatism, a second negative tradition, a French tradition this time, had prevailed over the first. A second tradition, or rather, what, echoing Heine's, quote, German misery, end quote, we might call our, quote, French misery, end quote. The stubborn, profound absence of any real theoretical culture in the history of the French workers' movement. The French party may have been able to reach its present position by using the general theory of the two sciences in the form of a radical proclamation. It may have been able to make it the test and proof of its indisputable political courage. But this also meant that it was living on meager theoretical reserves, those it had inherited from the past of the French workers' movement as a whole. In fact, other than the utopians Saint-Simon and Fourier, who Marx loved to invoke, Proudhon was not a Marxist at all, and Jaurès, who was, but only slightly, where were our theoreticians? In Germany, there were Marx and Engels and the earlier Kautsky. In Poland, Rosa Luxemburg. In Russia, Plekhanov and Lenin. In Italy, Labriola, who, parenthesis, when we had Sorel, exclamation point, and parenthesis, would correspond with Engels as equal to equal. Then Gramsci. Who were our theoreticians? Ged, Lafargue. A whole theoretical analysis would be necessary to account for this poverty, so striking when compared with the richness of other traditions. With no pretensions to undertake this analysis, a few reference points can at least be established. Without the efforts of intellectual workers, there could be no theoretical tradition in history or philosophy in the workers' movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The founders of historical and dialectical materialism were intellectuals, Marx and Engels. Their theory was developed by intellectuals, Kautsky, Plekhanov, Labriola, Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Gramsci. Neither at the beginning nor long afterwards could it have been otherwise. It cannot be otherwise, neither now nor in the future. What can change and will change is the class origin of intellectual workers, but not their characterization as intellectuals. Footnote. Naturally, the term, quote, intellectuals, end quote, denotes a very specific type of militant intellectual, a type unprecedented in many respects. These are real initiates, armed with the most authentic scientific and theoretical culture, forewarned of the crushing reality and manifold mechanisms of all forms of the ruling ideology, and constantly on the watch for them, enabling their theoretical practice to borrow, against the stream of all, quote, accepted truths, end quote, the fertile paths opened up by Marx, but bolted and barred by the reigning prejudices. An undertaking of this nature and this rigor is unthinkable without an unshakable and lucid confidence in the working class and direct participation in its struggles, end quote. End footnote. This is so for those reasons of principle that Lenin, following Kautsky, impressed upon us. On the one hand, the, quote, spontaneous and, quote, ideology of the workers, if left to itself, could only produce utopian socialism, trade unionism, anarchism, and anarcho-syndicalism. On the other hand, Marxist socialism, presupposing as it does the massive theoretical labor of the establishment and development of a science and a philosophy without precedent, could only be the work of men with a thorough historical, scientific, and philosophical formation, intellectuals of very high quality. That such intellectuals appeared in Germany, Russia, Poland, and Italy, either to found Marxist theory or to become masters of it, is not a matter of isolated accidents. The social, political, religious, ideological, and moral conditions prevailing in these countries quite simply denied their intellectuals any activity. The ruling classes, the nobility and the bourgeoisie, allied and united in their class interest and supported by the churches, could in general only offer them servile and derisory employment. Under these conditions, the intellectuals could only seek their freedom and future at the side of the working class, the only revolutionary class. In France, on the contrary, the bourgeoisie had been revolutionary. It had long been able to assimilate intellectuals to the bourgeoisie's revolution and to keep them as a whole at its side after the seizure and consolidation of power. The French bourgeoisie had successfully carried through a complete, clear revolution, driving the feudal class in the political stage, 1789, 1830, 1848. It had set the seal of its own command on the unity of the nation in the process of revolution itself. It had defeated the church and then adopted it, but only to separate itself at the right moment and cover itself with the slogans of liberty and equality. It had been able to use both its position of strength and its past standing to offer the intellectuals a sufficient space and future, sufficiently honorable functions, and a sufficient margin of freedom and illusion to keep them within its authority and under the control of its ideology. With a few important exceptions, who are precisely exceptions, French intellectuals accepted this situation and felt no vital need to seek their salvation at the side of the working class, and when they did rally to the working class, they could not radically cast off the bourgeois ideology in which they were steeped, and which survived in their idealism and reformism, Jaurès, or in their positivism. Nor was it accidental that the French party had to devote a long and courageous struggle to the reduction and destruction of a reflex ouvriériste. I guess it's workerist. Ouvriériste. I think that's what it says. Workerist is what I think it translates as. Distrust of intellectuals, which was in its own way the expression of a long historical experience of continual deception. Thus it was the forms of bourgeois domination themselves long deprived the French workers' movement of the intellectuals indispensable to the formation of an authentic theoretical tradition. Need I add another national reason? This is the pitiful history of French philosophy in the 130 years following the Revolution of 1789. Its spiritual persistence and reaction, not just conservatism, from Maine de Biran and cousin to Bergson, its contempt for history and for the people, its deep but narrow-minded ties with religion, its relentless hostility to the only mind worthy of interest that it produced, Auguste Comte, its incredible ignorance and lack of culture. In the last 30 years, things have taken another turn, but the burden of a long century of official philosophical stupidity has also played a part in crushing theory in the workers' movement itself. The French party was born in this theoretical vacuum, and it grew despite this vacuum, filling in as best it could the existing lacunas, nourishing itself from our sole authentic national tradition, the political tradition for which Marx had the most profound respect. Despite itself, it has been marked by this primacy of politics and a certain failure to appreciate the role of theory, particularly philosophical theory as opposed to political and economic theory. If it was able to rally itself some famous intellectuals, these were above all great writers, novelists, poets, and painters, great natural scientists, and also a few first-rate historians and psychologists, and they came primarily for political reasons, but it very rarely attracted men of sufficient philosophical formation to realize that Marxism should not be simply a political doctrine, a quote method of analysis and action, but also, over and above the rest, the theoretical domain of a fundamental investigation. indispensable not only to the development of the science of society and of the various human sciences but also to that of the natural sciences and philosophy. It was the fate of the French party to be born and to grow up in these conditions, without the heritage and assistance of a national theoretical tradition, and as an inevitable consequence, without a theoretical school which could produce masters. This was the reality we had to learn to spell out, and that all by ourselves because there were no really great philosophical mate in Marxist philosophy amongst us to guide our steps. Pulitzer, who might have become one if he had not sacrificed the great philosophical achievements he had in him to urgent economic tasks, left us only the genius of the errors in his Critique des fondements de la psychologie. Pulitzer was dead, or Pulitzer, I don't know how to say the name. Pulitzer was dead, assassinated by the Nazis. We had no mate, which I think is like masters. There was no lack of willing spirits, nor of highly cultivated minds, scholars, literary figures, and many more. But I mean masters of Marxist philosophy, emerging from our own history, accessible and close to us. This last condition is not a superfluous detail, for we have inherited from our national past not only a theoretical vacuum, but also a monstrous philosophical and cultural provincialism, our form of chauvinism. We do not read foreign languages, and more or less ignore anything that happens to be thought beyond a line of mountains, the course of a river or the width of a sea. It is an accident that in France the study and commentary of Marx's works has long been, is it an accident that in France the study and commentary of Marx's works has long been the work of a few courageous and tenacious Germanists? If the only name fit for display beyond our frontiers is that of a quiet lone hero who, unknown to French learning, spent many years in a minutely detailed study of the left neo-Hegelian movement and the young Marx, Auguste Cornu. These reflections throw some light on our predicament, but they do not abolish it. We are indebted to Stalin for the first shock, even within the evil for which he bears the prime responsibility. His death set off the second, his death in the 20th Congress, but meanwhile life had done its work among us as well. Neither a political organization nor a real theoretical culture can be created overnight or by a simple fiat. So many of the young philosophers who had come of age in the war or just after it were worn out by exhausting political tasks, but had taken no time off from them for scientific work. It is also characteristic of our social history that the intellectuals of petty bourgeois origin who came to the party at the time felt that they had to pay in pure activity, if not in political activism, the imaginary debt they thought they had contracted by not being proletarians. In his own way, Sartre provides us with an honest witness to this baptism of history. We were of his race as well. It is no doubt a gain of recent years that our younger comrades seem free of this debt, which perhaps they pay in some other way. Philosophically speaking, our generation sacrificed itself and sacrificed to political and ideological conflict alone, implying that it was sacrificed in its intellectual and scientific work. A number of scientists, occasionally even historians, and even a few rare literary figures came through unscathed, or at least only slightly bruised. There was no way out for a philosopher. If he spoke and wrote the philosophy of the party wanted, he was restricted to commentary and slight idiosyncrasies in his own way of using the famous quotations. We had no audience among our peers. Our enemies flung in our faces the charges that we were merely politicians. Our most enlightened colleagues argued that we ought to study our authors before judging them, justify our principles objectively before proclaiming and applying them, to force their best opponents to pay them some attention. Some Marxist philosophers were reduced, and by a natural movement which did not conceal a conscious tactic, to disguising themselves, disguising Marx as Husserl, Marx as Hegel, Marx as the ethical and humanist young Marx, at the risk of someday taking the masks for reality. This is no exaggeration, simply the facts. We are still living the consequences today. We are politically and philosophically convinced that we had reached the only firm ground in the world, but as we could not demonstrate its existence or firmness philosophically, no one else could see any firm ground beneath our... Sorry, this word's... I think it might be feet. Only conviction. I am not discussing the spread of Marxism, which luckily can radiate from other spheres than the philosophical. I'm discussing the paradoxically precarious existence of Marxist philosophy as such. We thought we knew the principles of all possible philosophy and of the impossibility of all philosophical ideology, but we failed to offer an objective and public proof of the apodicity of our convictions. Once aware of the vacuity of the dogmatic approach, we were left with only one way of accepting the impossible situation we had been reduced to in our efforts toward a real grasp of our philosophy. To treat philosophy itself as impossible. So we were led into that great subtle temptation, the quote, end of philosophy, end quote, encouraged by some enigmatically clear text in Marx's early works, 1840 to 45, and of his epistemological break, 1845. Those of us who were the most militant and the most generous tended towards an interpretation of the quote, end of philosophy, end quote, as its quote, realization, end quote, and celebrated the death of philosophy in action, in its political realization and proletarian consummation, unreservedly endorsing the famous thesis on Feuerbach which, in theoretically ambiguous words, counterposes the transformation of the world to its interpretation. It was, and always will be, only a short step from here to theoretical pragmatism. Others of more scientific bent proclaim the quote, end of philosophy, end quote, in the manner of certain positivistic formulations in the German ideology, in which it is no longer the proletariat or revolutionary action which take in charge the realization and thereby the death of philosophy, but science pure and simple. Does not Marx call on us to stop philosophizing, that is, stop developing ideological reveries, so that we can move on to the study of reality itself? Politically speaking, the former of these two readings was that of the majority of those philosophical militants who gave themselves completely to politics, making philosophy the religion of their action. The latter, on the contrary, was that of those critics who hoped that a scientific approach would fill out the empty proclamations of dogmatic philosophy. But if both groups made their peace with politics, both paid for it with a bad philosophical conscience. A practico-religious or positivist death of philosophy is not really a philosophical death of philosophy. So we contorted ourselves to give philosophy a death worthy of philosophy, a philosophical death. Here again we sought support from more text of Marx, and from a third reading of the others, we proceeded on the assumption that the end of philosophy could not but be critical, as the subtitle of Capital proclaims that book to be of political economy. It is essential to go to the things themselves, to finish with philosophical ideologies, and to turn to the study of the real world. But, and this we hoped would secure us from positivism, in turning against ideology, we saw that it constantly threatened the, quote, understanding of positive things, end quote, besieged science and obscured real characteristics. So we entrusted philosophy with the continual critical reduction of the thread of ideological illusion, and in doing so we made philosophy the conscience of science pure and simple, reduced philosophy completely to the letter and body of science, but merely turned against its negative surroundings as its vigilant conscience, the consciousness of those surroundings that could reduce them to nothing. Thus philosophy was certainly at an end, at an end, but it survived nonetheless as an evanescent critical consciousness for just long enough to project the positive essence of science onto the threatening ideology, and to destroy the enemy's ideological phantasms before returning to its place amongst its allies. The critical death of philosophy, identified with its evanescent philosophical existence, gave us at last the status and deserts of a really philosophical death, consummated in the ambiguous act of criticism. Now philosophy had no fate other than the consummation of its critical death in the recognition of the real, and in the return to the real history, the progenitor of men's acts and men's thoughts. Philosophy meant retracing on our own account the young Marxist critical odyssey, breaking through the layer of illusion that was hiding the real world from us, and arriving at last in our native land, the land of history, to find there at last the rest afforded by reality and science in concord with the perpetual vigilance of criticism. According to this reading, there could no longer be any question of a history of philosophy. How could there be a history of dissipated phantasms, of shadows traversed? The only history possible is that of reality, which may dimly arouse in the sleeper incoherent dreams. How the hell am I? But these dreams, whose only continuity is derived from their anchorage in these depths, can never make up a continent of history in their own right. Marx said to himself in the German ideology, quote, "Philosophy has no history," end quote. When you come to read the essay on the young Marx, you will be able to judge it if it is not still partly trapped in the mythical hope for a philosophy which will achieve its philosophical end in the living death of a critical consciousness. New section. I have recalled these investigations and these choices because in their own way they carry the traces of our history, and also because the end of Stalinist dogmatism has not completely dissipated them as mere circumstantial reflexes. They are still our problems. Those who impute all our disappointments, all our mistakes, and all our disarrays in whatever domain to Stalin, along with Stalin's crimes and errors, are likely to be disconcerted by having to admit that the end of Stalinist dogmatism has not restored Marxist philosophy to us in its integrity. After all, it is never possible to liberate even from dogmatism more than already exists. The end of dogmatism produced a real freedom of investigation, and also in some a feverish haste to make philosophy an ideological commentary on their feeling of liberation and their taste for freedom. Fever sank as surely as stones. What the end of dogmatism has restored to us is the right to assess exactly what we have, to give both our wealth and our poverty their true names, to think and pose our problems in the open, and to undertake in rigor a true investigation. It makes it possible for us to emerge partly from our theoretical provincialism, to recognize and acquaint ourselves with those who did exist and do exist outside us, and as we see this outside, we can begin to see ourselves from the outside and discover the place we occupy in the knowledge and ignorance of Marxism, and thereby begin to know ourselves. The end of dogmatism puts us face to face with this reality, that Marxist philosophy, founded by Marx in the very act of founding his theory of history, is still largely to be constituted, since, as Lenin said, only the cornerstones have been laid down, that the theoretical difficulties we debated in the dogmatist night were not completely artificial. Rather, they were largely the result of a meagerly elaborated Marxist philosophy, or, better, that in the rigid caricatural forms we suffered or maintained, including the theoretical monstrosity of the two sciences, something of an unsettled problem was really present in grotesque and blind forms. The writings of theoretical capital L leftism, the young Lukács and Korsch, which have recently been republished, are a sufficient witness to this. And finally, that our lot and our duty today is quite simply to pose and confront these problems in the light of day, if Marxist philosophy is to acquire some real existence or achieve a little theoretical consistency. Section 2. I should like to give some guidance to the road traversed by the notes you are about to read. The piece on the young Marx is still trapped in the myth of an evanescent critical philosophy. Nevertheless, it does contain the essential question, irresistibly drawn from us even by our trials, failures, and impotence. What is Marxist philosophy? Has Marxist philosophy any theoretical right to existence? And if Marxist philosophy does exist in principle, how can Marxist philosophy's specificity be defined? This essential question was raised practically by another, apparently historical but really theoretical question, the question of reading and interpreting Marx's early works. It was no accident that it seemed indispensable to submit these famous texts to a serious critical examination, these texts which had been inscribed on every banner in every field, these openly philosophical texts in which we had hoped to read Marx's personal philosophy more or less spontaneously. The question of Marxist philosophy and of Marxist philosophy's specificity with respect to Marx's early works necessarily implies the question of Marx's relation to the philosophies he had espoused or traversed, those of Hegel and Feuerbach, and therefore the question of where he differed from them. It was the study of the works of Marx's youth that first led me to a reading of Feuerbach and to the publication of the most important of his theoretical writings in the period of 1839 to 1845. The same reasoning quite naturally led me to begin studying the nature of the relation of Hegel's philosophy to Marx's in the detail of their respective concepts. The question of the specific differences of Marxist philosophy has assumed the form of the question as to whether or not there was an epistemological break in Marx's intellectual development, indicating the emergence of a new conception of philosophy, and the related question of the precise location of this break. Within the field defined by this question, the study of Marx's early works acquired a decisive theoretical importance. Does this break exist? As well as a historical importance. Where is it located? Of course, the quotation in which Marx himself attests to and locates this break, quote, "We resolved to settle accounts with our erstwhile philosophical conscience," end quote, in 1845 at the level of the German ideology, can only be treated as a declaration to be examined and falsified or confirmed, not as a proof of the existence of the break and a definition of the break's location. The examination of the status of this declaration called for a theory and a method, the Marxist theoretical concepts, in which the reality of theoretical formations in general, philosophical ideologies, and science can be considered, must be applied to Marx himself. Without a theory of the history of theoretical formation, it would be impossible to grasp and indicate the specific difference that distinguishes two different theoretical formations. I thought it possible to borrow for this purpose the concept of a, quote, problematic, end quote, from Jacques Martin, to designate the particular unity of a theoretical formation, and hence the location to be assigned to this specific difference, and the concept of a, quote, epistemological break, end quote, from Gaston Bachelard, to designate the mutation in the theoretical problematic contemporary with the foundation of a scientific discipline. That one of those concepts had to be constructed and the other borrowed does not imply at all that either is arbitrary or foreign to Marx. On the contrary, it can be shown that both are present and active in Marx's scientific thought, even if this presence is most often in the practical state. Footnote: on this dual theme of the problematic and of the epistemological break, the break indicating the mutation of a pre-scientific problematic into a scientific problematic, see the pages of extraordinary theoretical profundity in Engels' preface to the second volume of Capital. I shall give a brief summary of them in Lire le Capital, Volume 2. I don't know if that ever came into existence on Volume 2 of Reading Capital. Anyway, end footnote. These two concepts provided me with the indispensable theoretical minimum, authorizing a pertinent analysis of the process of the theoretical transformation of the young Marx, and leading to some precise conclusions. Let me summarize here in extremely abbreviated form some of the results of a study which took several years, into which the pieces I am presenting here bear only partial witness. 1. There is an unequivocal, quote, epistemological break, end quote, in Marx's work, which does in fact occur at the point where Marx himself locates it, in the book unpublished in his lifetime, which is a critique of his erstwhile philosophical ideological conscience, the German ideology. The theses on Feuerbach, which are only a few sentences long, mark out the earlier limit of this break, the point at which the new theoretical consciousness is already beginning to show through in the erstwhile consciousness and the erstwhile language, that is, as necessarily ambiguous and unbalanced concepts. As necessarily ambiguous and unbalanced concepts. 2. This, quote, epistemological break concerns conjointly two distinct theoretical disciplines. By founding the theory of history, historical materialism, Marx simultaneously broke with his erstwhile ideological philosophy and established a new philosophy, dialectical materialism. Again, that was a name given after the fact by Plekhanov. I am deliberately using the traditionally accepted terminology, historical materialism, dialectical materialism, to designate this double foundation in a single break. And I should point out two important problems implied by this exceptional circumstance. Of course, if the birth of a new philosophy is simultaneous with the foundation of a new science, and this science is the science of history, a crucial theoretical problem arises. By what necessity of principle should the foundation of the scientific theory of history ipso facto imply a theoretical revolution in philosophy? This same circumstance also entails a considerable practical consequence. As the new philosophy was only implicit in the new science, it might be tempted to confuse itself with it. As the new philosophy was only implicit in the new science, it might be tempted to confuse itself with it. The German ideology sanctions this confusion, as it reduces philosophy, as we have noted, to a faint shadow of science, if not the empty generality of positivism. This practical consequence is one of the keys to the remarkable history of Marxist philosophy, from its origins to the present day. I shall examine these two problems later. 3. This, quote, epistemological break divides Marx's thought into two long essential periods, the, quote, ideological period before and the scientific period after the break in 1945. The second period can itself be divided into two moments, the moment of Marx's theoretical transition and that of his theoretical maturity. To simplify the philosophical and historical labors in front of us, I should like to propose the following provisional terminology which registers the above periodization. A. I propose to designate the works of the earlier period, that is, everything Marx wrote from his doctoral dissertation to the 1844 manuscripts in the Holy Family, by the already accepted formula, Marx's early works. B. I propose to designate the writings of the break in 1845, that is, the theses on Feuerbach and the German ideology, which first introduced Marx's new problematic, though usually still in a partially negative and sharply polemical and critical form, by a new formula, the works of the break. C. I propose to designate the works of the period 1845 to 57 by a new formula, the transitional works. While it is possible to assign the crucial date of the works of 1845, the theses on Feuerbach and the German ideology, to the break separating the scientific from the ideological, it must be remembered that this mutation could not produce immediately in positive and consummated form the theoretical problematic which it inaugurated in the theory of history as well as in that of philosophy. In fact, the German ideology is a commentary, usually a negative and critical commentary, on the different forms of the ideological problematic Marx had rejected. Long years of positive study and the elaboration were necessary before Marx could produce, fashion, and establish a conceptual terminology and systematics that were adequate to his revolutionary theoretical object. That is why I propose to designate the works written between 1845 and the first drafts of Capital around 1845 to 57, that is, the Manifesto, the Poverty of Philosophy, Wages, Price and Profit, etc., as the works of Marx's theoretical transition. D. Finally, I propose to designate all the works after 1857 as Marx's mature works. This gives us the following classification: 1840 to 44, the early works; 1845, the works of the break; 1845 to 57, the transitional works; 1857 to 83, the mature works. The period of Marx's early works, 1840 to 1845, that is the period of his ideological works, can itself be subdivided into two moments. A. The liberal rationalist movement of his articles in Die Rheinische Zeitung up to 1842. B. The communalist rationalist movement of the years 1842 to 45. My essay on the title Marxism and Humanism briefly suggests, as my essay on Marxism and Humanism briefly suggests, the presupposition of the works of the first movement is a problematic of Kantian Fichtean type. Those of the second movement, on the contrary, rest on Feuerbach's anthropological problematic. The Hegelian problematic inspires one absolutely unique text, which is a rigorous attempt to, quote, invert Hegelian idealism in the strict sense into Feuerbach's pseudo-materialism. This text is the 1844 manuscripts. Paradoxically, therefore, if we exclude the doctoral dissertation, which is still the work of a student, the young Marx was never strictly speaking a Hegelian. Except in the last text of his ideological philosophical period. Rather, Marx was first a Kantian Fichtean, then a Feuerbachian. So the thesis that the young Marx was a Hegelian, though widely believed today, is in general a myth. On the contrary, it seems that Marx's one and only resort to Hegel in his youth, on the eve of his rupture with his erstwhile philosophical conscience, end quote, produced the prodigious, quote, abreaction, end quote, indispensable to the liquidation of his, quote, disordered, end quote, consciousness. Until then, he had always kept his distance from Hegel, and to grasp the movement whereby Marx passed from his Hegelian university studies to a Kantian Fichtean problematic, and thence to a Feuerbachian problematic, we must realize that, far from being close to Hegel, Marx moved further and further away from Hegel. With Fichte and Kant, he had worked his way back to the end of the 18th century, and then with Feuerbach, he regressed to the heart of the theoretical past of that century, for in his own way Feuerbach may be said to represent the, quote, ideal 18th century philosopher, the synthesis of sensualist materialism and ethico-historical idealism, the real union of Diderot and Rousseau. It would be difficult not to speculate that Marx's sudden and total last return to Hegel and that genial synthesis of Feuerbach and Hegel, the 1844 manuscripts, might not have been an explosive experiment uniting the substances of the two extremes of the theoretical field, which he had until then frequented, that this extraordinarily rigorous and conscientious experiment, the most extreme test of the, quote, inversion of Hegel ever attempted, might not have been the way Marx lived practically and achieved his own transformation in a text which, whenever published, in a text which he never published. Jesus Christ. It's like he never is like squished together. So I thought it was a typo of whenever. Some idea of the logic of this prodigious mutation is given by the extraordinary theoretical tension of the 1844 manuscripts, for we know in advance the paradox that the text of the last hours of the night is, theoretically speaking, the text the furthest removed from the day that it is about to dawn. 5. The works of the break raise delicate problems of interpretation, precisely as a function of their place in the theoretical formation of Marxist thought. Those brief sparks, the theses on Feuerbach, light up every philosopher who comes near them, but as is well known, a spark dazzles rather than illuminates. Nothing is more difficult to locate in the darkness of the night than the point of light which breaks it. One day we will have to show that these 11 deceptively transparent theses are really riddles. As for the German ideology, it offers us precisely a thought in a state of rupture with its past, playing a pitiless game of deadly criticism with all its erstwhile theoretical presuppositions, primarily with Feuerbach and Hegel, and all the forms of a philosophy of consciousness and an anthropological philosophy. But this new thought, so firm and precise in its interrogation of ideological error, cannot define itself without difficulties and ambiguities. It is impossible to break with a theoretical past at one blow. In every case, words and concepts are needed to break with words and concepts. And often the old words are charged with the conduct of the rupture throughout the period of the search for new ones. The German ideology presents the spectacle of a re-enlisted conceptual reserve standing in for new concepts still in training. ... And as we usually judge these old concepts by their bearing, taking them at their word, it is easy to stray into a positivist conception, the end of all philosophy, or an individualist humanist conception. The subjects of history are, quote, real concrete men, end quote. Or again, it is possible to be taken in by the ambiguous role of the division of labor, which in this book plays the principal part, taken by alienation in the writings of his youth, and commands the whole theory of ideology and the whole theory of science. This all arises from its proximity to the break, and that is why the German ideology alone demands a major critical effort to distinguish the supplementary theoretical function of particular concepts from the concepts themselves. I shall return to this. 6. Locating the break in 1845 is not without important theoretical consequences as regards not only the relation between Marx and Feuerbach, but also the relation between Marx and Hegel. Indeed, Marx did not first develop a systematic critique of Hegel after 1845. He had been doing so since the beginning of the second moment of his youthful period. In the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, 1843 manuscript, the introduction to a critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, 1843, the 1844 manuscript in the Holy Family, but the theoretical principles on which this critique of Hegel was based were merely a reprise, a commentary or a development, and extension of the admirable critique of Hegel repeatedly formulated by Feuerbach. It is a critique of Hegelian philosophy as speculative and abstract, a critique appealing to the concrete materialist against the abstract speculative, i.e. a critique which remains a prisoner of the idealist problematic it hoped to free itself from, and therefore a critique which belongs by right to the theoretical problematic with which Marx broke in 1845. In the search for Marxist philosophy and in its definition, it is clear that the Marxist critique of Hegel should not be confused with the Feuerbachian critique of Hegel, even if Marx started it in his name. The decision as to whether or not the critique in Marx's writings of 1843 is Marxist, in fact it is Feuerbachian through and through, makes a major difference to our idea of the nature of Marx's later philosophy. I stress this as a crucial point for contemporary interpretations of Marxist philosophy, by which I mean serious systematic interpretations based on real philosophical, epistemological, and historical knowledge, and on rigorous reading methods, not mere opinions. Books can be written on this basis too. For example, there are the writings of Coletti and Della Volpe in Italy, which I regard as of the greatest importance, because in our time they are the only scholars who have made an irreconcilable theoretical distinction between Marx and Hegel and a definition of the specificity of Marxist philosophy, the conscious center of their investigations. Their work certainly presupposes the existence of a break between Marx and Hegel and between Marx and Feuerbach, but they locate it in 1843 at the level of the introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right! Such a simple displacement of the break profoundly affects all the theoretical conclusions drawn from it, and not only their conception of Marxist philosophy, but also, as a later work will show, their reading and interpretation of Capital. New section. I have permitted myself these remarks so as to clarify the meaning of the pages devoted to Feuerbach and the young Marx, and so as to reveal the unity of the problem dominating these notes, since the essays on contradiction and on the dialectic equally concern a definition of the irreducible specificity of Marxist theory. That this definition cannot be read directly in Marx's writings, that a complete prior critique is indispensable to an identification of the location of the real concepts of Marx's maturity, that the identification of these concepts is the same thing as the identification of their location, that all this critical effort, the absolute precondition of any interpretation, in itself presupposes activating a minimum of provisional Marxist theoretical concepts bearing on the nature of theoretical formations and their history, that the precondition of a reading of Marx is a Marxist theory of the differential nature of theoretical formations and their history, that is a theory of epistemological history, which is Marxist philosophy itself, that this operation in itself constitutes an indispensable circle in which the application of Marxist theory to Marx himself appears to be the absolute precondition of an understanding of Marx, and at the same time the precondition even of the constitution and development of Marxist philosophy. So much is clear, but the circle implied by this operation is, like all circles of this kind, simply the dialectical circle of the question asked of an object as to its nature, on the basis of a theoretical problematic which, in putting its object to the test, puts itself to the test of its object. That Marxism can and must itself be the object of the epistemological question, that this epistemological question can only be asked as a function of the Marxist theoretical problematic, that is necessity itself for a theory which defines itself dialectically, not merely as a science of history, historical materialism, but also and simultaneously as a philosophy that is capable of accounting for the nature of theoretical formations and their history, and therefore capable of accounting for itself, by taking itself as its own object. Marxism is the only philosophy that theoretically faces up to this test. All this critical effort is indispensable, not only to a reading of Marx, which is not just an immediate reading, deceived either by the false transparency of his youthful ideological conceptions, or by the perhaps still more dangerous false transparency of the apparently familiar concepts of the works of the break. This work, which is essential to a reading of Marx, is, in the strict sense, simultaneously the work of theoretical elaboration of Marxist philosophy, a theory which enables us to see clearly in Marx, to distinguish science from ideology, to deal with the difference between them within the historical relation between them, and to deal with the discontinuity of the epistemological break within the continuity of a historical process, a theory which makes it possible to distinguish a word from a concept, to distinguish the existence or non-existence of a concept behind a word, to discern the existence of a concept by a word's function in the theoretical discourse, to define the nature of a concept by its function in the problematic, and thus by the location it occupies in the system of the, quote, theory. This theory which alone makes possible an authentic reading of Marx's writings, a reading which is both epistemological and historical. This theory is in fact simply Marxist philosophy itself. We set out in search of it, and here it begins to emerge, along with its own first, most elementary demand, the demand for a simple definition of the precondition of this search. Althusser, March 1965. And that's the end of the introduction, Althusser's introduction to For Marx.